could discuss everyone's thoughts openly. The calm confidence in her voice made Sarah pause mid-sentence during what had clearly been prepared to be another lecture about practical considerations and safety concerns. That weekend meeting became the turning point Margaret hadn't expected. As her 4 adult children sat around her dining room table, she watched their faces carefully while she presented her own research about independent living options, her financial situation, and her health assessments. For the first time in years, she wasn't defending herself. She was leading the conversation. The second strategy emerged naturally. She started asking them questions about their own lives, their stresses, their fears about her aging, rather than simply reacting to their decisions about her future. What surprised Margaret most was discovering how much her children had been struggling with their own late-life choices. Her eldest son, David, confessed he'd been having sleepless nights about potentially inheriting the responsibility of her care while managing his teenage daughter's college expenses. Her youngest, Patricia, admitted she'd been researching care facilities not out of dismissiveness, but out of terror that she wouldn't know how to help if something happened. The family dynamics she'd assumed were about control were actually rooted in love and fear. But the real test came 3 weeks later when Margaret's neighbor, Helen, fell and broke her hip. Helen's children immediately swooped in, sold her house within days, and moved her to a care facility 2 hours away before she'd even finished physical therapy. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as strangers packed Helen's belongings, knowing her own children were watching too, waiting to see how she'd react to this cautionary tale playing out next door. The phone call started that evening. Each of her children reached out separately, their voices careful and loaded with implication. "Did you see what happened to Helen?" became the unspoken question underlying every conversation. Margaret realized this moment would define everything. Would she use Helen's situation to prove her point about aging with dignity and choice, or would her children use it as evidence that their original plan had been right all along? The fourth strategy required Margaret to make the most difficult decision she'd faced since Robert's death. She had to choose between the security of letting her children take control and the uncertainty of proving she could handle whatever challenges aging might bring. But as she sat in her garden that evening, surrounded by the roses she'd nurtured for decades, she understood that second chances in life don't come from avoiding difficult choices. They come from making them with wisdom and courage. The question that kept her awake that night wasn't whether she could maintain her independence. It was whether she was ready to show her children what true strength looked like when everything familiar started falling apart. The call came at 6 in the morning, jolting Margaret from restless sleep. Patricia's voice was shaking. "Mom, David's in the hospital. Heart attack. They don't know if he's going to make it." In that instant, every conversation about Margaret's future became irrelevant. Her eldest son, the one who'd been most worried about taking care of her, was fighting for his life at 52. Margaret arrived at the hospital to find her 3 remaining children huddled together, looking lost and younger than they had in decades. Sarah was on the phone with insurance companies, her usual take-charge attitude cracking under the weight of fear. Patricia sat clutching David's teenage daughter, both of them crying. Her youngest son, Michael, paced the hallway, the same nervous energy he'd had as a child when thunderstorms kept him awake. But something unexpected happened as Margaret walked into that waiting room. Instead of becoming the fragile elder who needed protection, she became the person she'd always been. The problem solver, the steady presence, the one who held families together during crisis. Without thinking, she took charge of the practical details her children were struggling to manage, coordinated with doctors, and somehow found herself becoming the anchor they all desperately needed. The fifth strategy revealed itself through necessity rather than planning. Margaret realized that rediscovery after 60 wasn't about proving she didn't need help. It was about showing that her experience and wisdom were still valuable resources her family could rely on. While her children focused on David's immediate medical needs, Margaret quietly handled everything else. She arranged for David's daughter to stay with her, coordinated work coverage for the other children, and somehow managed to bring order to the chaos that medical emergencies create. 3 days into David's hospitalization, As Margaret sat beside his bed during visiting hours, he opened his eyes and whispered something that changed everything. "Mom, I was wrong about the house. You don't need us to take care of you. We need you to take care of us." The vulnerability in his voice carried the weight of years of misunderstood intentions and misdirected protection. But the real shock came when David's cardiologist approached Margaret privately. "Your son mentioned you were a school principal. We're actually starting a new program here, using retired professionals as patient advocates and family liaisons. Would you be interested?" The offer represented something Margaret hadn't expected: new beginnings that could bridge her need for purpose with her family's need for her strength. Standing in that hospital hallway, Margaret faced a choice that would redefine not just her relationship with her children, but her entire understanding of what aging with purpose could look like. The opportunity for healing family bonds had arrived, wrapped in crisis, and she had mere hours to decide whether she was ready to step into a role none of them had seen coming. Margaret walked back to David's room, where her children had gathered around his bedside. His color was returning, and the monitors showed steady improvement. But the fear in her children's eyes told a different story. They were finally seeing their own mortality reflected in their brother's close call. Sarah reached for Margaret's hand, something she hadn't done since childhood. "Mom, we've been thinking about everything wrong. We were so afraid of losing you that we forgot to actually see you." The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was tending to her roses. Her daughter's voice cut through the peaceful garden air like a blade. "Mom, we've decided you can't live alone anymore. We're putting the house on the market next month." No discussion, no asking how she felt. Just a cold, calculated decision made without her input. At 73, Margaret had raised 4 children, built a successful career as a school principal, and maintained her independence through life after 60 with grace and determination. Yet here she was, being treated like a child who couldn't make her own choices. Sound familiar? If you're nodding your head right now, you're not alone. Millions of seniors face this heartbreaking reality: the gradual erosion of respect from the very people they devoted their lives to raising. The dismissive comments, the decisions made behind closed doors, the subtle and not so subtle suggestions that your opinions no longer matter simply because you've crossed an invisible age threshold. But here's what Margaret discovered that Tuesday morning, standing among her prize-winning roses with tears streaming down her face. Losing respect isn't an argument. It's a choice, both theirs and yours. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't fighting back with anger or retreating in a hurt silence. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your emotional wisdom and showing them exactly who you still are. Margaret's story isn't unique, but her response was extraordinary. Over the following weeks, she implemented 6 specific strategies that not only transformed her relationship with her children, but also reignited her sense of senior empowerment. These weren't manipulative tactics or guilt trips. They were authentic, heart-centered approaches rooted in decades of life experience and emotional strength. The first strategy surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of arguing about the house sale, she did something completely unexpected that made her adult children stop in their tracks and really see her for the first time in years. The second approach involved a conversation technique that shifted the entire family dynamic overnight. By the 3rd week, her son, the one who'd been most dismissive, was asking for her advice on a major life decision. What Margaret learned applies to every senior navigating the complex waters of changing family relationships. Whether you're dealing with adult children who've forgotten your value, grandchildren who barely acknowledge your presence, or family members who've started making decisions for your own good without consulting you, these 6 strategies can help you reclaim your rightful place in your family's respect and consideration. The beauty of Margaret's approach was its authenticity. She didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't or resort to dramatic gestures. Instead, she tapped into the deep well of emotional wisdom that comes with independent living and decades of experience. She understood something profound. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you inspire. But the real test came 3 months later. when her family faced a crisis that would determine whether her newfound approach had truly changed their relationship dynamics. What happened next would surprise everyone, including Margaret herself. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she could maintain this new respect, but whether she was ready for the unexpected responsibility that came with it. Would Margaret's 6 strategies hold up under pressure? And more importantly, was she prepared for what her children would ask of her when they finally saw her strength? Margaret had been here before, though not quite like this. 35 years ago, when her husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, her 4 children had rallied around her with a protectiveness that felt suffocating. Back then, at 38, she'd been expected to crumble, to need rescuing. Instead, she'd surprised everyone by returning to graduate school and eventually becoming the youngest female principal in her district's history. But somewhere along the way, that fierce independence had become invisible to her children. Life after retirement had been different than she'd imagined. The first year felt like an extended vacation, sleeping in, reading novels, traveling to places she'd only dreamed about. But by the second year, the quiet house began to echo with questions she hadn't expected. Who was she without her career? Without daily purpose driving her forward? The woman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and parent-teacher conferences now felt herself shrinking in her own living room when her children visited. The shift had been gradual, almost imperceptible. It started with helpful suggestions about her driving at night, then gentle recommendations about simplifying her finances. Soon, conversations that once included her perspective began happening around her instead of with her. Family decisions were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. The invisible transition from respected matriarch to fragile elder had happened without her consent or even her awareness until that Tuesday morning phone call. Senior reflection brought painful clarity. Margaret realized she'd been complicit in her own diminishing. After Robert's death, she'd poured everything into her children's success, celebrating their achievements while quietly stepping back from her own. When they didn't need her daily guidance anymore, she'd assumed her active role in their lives was over. But emotional resilience, she was learning, meant recognizing that stepping back didn't mean stepping down. The irony wasn't lost on her. At work, she'd been known for her ability to handle difficult parents, rebellious teenagers, and complex administrative challenges with wisdom and grace. She'd mentored countless young teachers, mediated family conflicts, and made decisions affecting hundreds of lives. Yet somehow, finding purpose within her own family had become her greatest challenge. That evening after the phone call, Margaret sat in Robert's old chair and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her frustration. Not just at her children, but at herself for allowing this dynamic to take root. She thought about the teachers she'd coached over the years, how she'd always told them that respect in the classroom wasn't about demanding authority, but about demonstrating competence and care. Why had she forgotten that lesson in her own home? The realization hit her with stunning clarity. Her children didn't disrespect her because she was older or more fragile. They disrespected her because she'd stopped showing up as the confident, capable woman she'd always been. Somewhere in her desire to avoid being a burden, she'd become invisible. But invisibility, Margaret decided that night, was a choice she could unmake. The sixth strategy emerged in that moment of raw honesty. Margaret looked at each of her children and said something she'd never articulated before. I'm not afraid of getting older. I'm afraid of becoming invisible. When you make decisions about my life without including me, you're not protecting me, you're erasing me. The words hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds, carrying the weight of years of misunderstanding and the possibility of something completely different. Michael was the first to break the silence. When did we start treating you like a problem to solve instead of a person to respect? The question opened floodgates of emotion that had been building for years. Patricia admitted she'd been projecting her own fears about aging onto her mother. Sarah confessed she'd been trying to control everything because she couldn't bear the thought of losing another parent. Each revelation brought them closer to understanding what true emotional closure looked like. But the moment that changed everything came when David's 16-year-old daughter spoke up. "Grandma, you're the strongest person I know. When my dad was sick, you didn't fall apart. You held all of us together. Why would anyone think you can't take care of yourself?" The wisdom with age that Margaret had been trying to demonstrate was suddenly visible through the eyes of the youngest family member. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear or frustration, but a profound sense of life's turning point after 60. She realized that respect wasn't something to be earned or demanded. It was something to be lived. "I'll take the hospital position," she announced, surprising everyone, including herself. "And I'll keep my house. But I want Sunday dinners with all of you every week, where we actually talk to each other instead of making assumptions." David squeezed her hand weakly. "Deal. But only if you promise to tell us when you need help instead of us having to guess." The simplicity of the request revealed the complexity of what they'd all been avoiding. Honest communication about aging, fear, love, and the courage to stay connected while letting go. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the people she'd raised and who had raised her in return, Margaret understood that the greatest strategy of all was the one she'd almost forgotten: showing up authentically as herself. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the hospital lobby wearing her new volunteer badge, watching families navigate their own crises with the same mixture of fear and love she'd witnessed in her own children. The patient advocate program had become more than a job. It had become her calling. Every day brought opportunities to help families communicate more clearly, to bridge the gap between medical jargon and human understanding, to show that experience and wisdom could still make a difference. The Sunday dinners had become legendary on the news. Margaret's dining room table, once quiet and unused, now overflowed with her children, her spouses, and her grandchildren everywhere. But these weren't the polite, surface-level gatherings of the past. These were real conversations about real struggles, where Margaret's perspective was sought rather than tolerated. Her children had learned to ask for her advice on everything from parenting challenges to career decisions, and Margaret had learned to offer support without taking over. David's recovery had been complete, but the experience had changed him in ways that went beyond his physical health. He'd become the family's unofficial keeper of memories, documenting stories and traditions that might otherwise be forgotten. "I realized I was so focused on protecting you from life that I forgot to learn from yours," he told Margaret one evening as they worked together in her garden. The roses she'd tended for decades now had company. David had taken up gardening as part of his rehabilitation, and their weekly conversations over pruning shears had become treasure time for both of them. Senior resilience, Margaret had discovered, wasn't about proving she could handle everything alone. It was about recognizing that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create space for others to show their strength too. Her children had needed to be needed, and she had needed to be valued. The solution had been finding ways to honor both needs without sacrificing either. The house sale that had started this whole journey never happened. Instead, Margaret had made small modifications that addressed her children's safety concerns while preserving her independence. Motion sensor lights, grab bars disguised as decorative fixtures, and a medical alert system that she actually used became symbols of compromise rather than defeat. Life's quiet victories, she learned, often looked like practical solutions wrapped in mutual respect. On quiet evenings, Margaret often sat in Robert's chair and reflected on the timeless lessons this experience had taught her. The most profound realization was that aging doesn't diminish your value, it deepens it. Every challenge overcome, every relationship navigated, every loss survived becomes part of a wisdom that can't be learned from books or acquired through youth. The key was remembering that this wisdom was meant to be shared, not hidden away. Margaret's story wasn't unique, but her response had been transformative. She'd learned that respect isn't something you demand or lose. It's something you cultivate by showing up fully as the person you've always been, just with more chapters in your story.